I would like to welcome you to this wonderful and rather unusual conference.
In an open and impartial atmosphere.
And now it's starting now.
My lecture today will be dealing with the question of the whereabouts of the Accra fortifications. In the beginning of the 2nd century BC, namely around the year 167, and this is, by the way, a reconstruction of the fortifications found at the Givati parking lot. I'm going to discuss that sometime later. In around the year 167 BC, we have the region of Judea controlled by the Seleucid dynasty, namely by Antiochus IV. And we have here one of his coins, and we can see also here, we can read the name of Basileus Antiochou Theu Epiphanes, and according to the book of Maccabees, which is one of the two major sources that we have on the issue of the Accra, a book written contemporary to the building of the Accra, sometime later perhaps in the Hasmonean era, late 2nd century BC, we read the following about Antiochus invading Jerusalem, and thereupon they fortified, that is the Seleucids, fortified the city of David with a high strong wall and strong towers so as to have a citadel, the Akra. They stationed in it a breed of sinners, wicked men who grew strong there. The garrison became a dangerous menace. So this is the Akra built by Antiochus IV according to the book of Maccabees. It is to be found in the city of David according to this description, and it is also called an Akra. Akra means a high elevated place, fortified. In other books we read the term Acropolis in Josephus, and the Akra is in the city of David. Later descriptions of the location of the Accra to be found in the books of Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian who lived a bit later in the 1st century AD, show that the city of David is also the lower city of Jerusalem. So the Accra should be found in the city of David, i.e. the city, the lower city, and it is a high place, which sounds a bit contradictory. And this led some scholars, many scholars actually, to assume that maybe the Accra was not really located in the city of David, but rather, some suggest, here north of the Temple Mount, or perhaps up here on the Western Hill. But actually this contradiction is only an apparent contradiction, as the term lower city is used in the books of Josephus Flavius, that is the end of the 2nd Temple period. In his times, the upper city was on the Western Hill, including, I believe, the slopes, and the city of David was called the lower city. That could include also the area as high as next to the temple. And here we see the Dome of the Rock today, the site of the old Jewish temple until its destruction in the year 70. So I do not think there is any kind of discrepancy or any kind of controversy around that question. And this is going to be a vital clue later on. So what we see here are the three major sites that I'm going to be concentrating on. One, the area of the Temple Mount and roughly the area of the temple itself, according to modern scholars. The city of David, and the book of Maccabees speaks about the city of David as the city as opposed to Mount Zion, which is the name kept for the area of the Temple Mount. And here we have also in the middle the Givati parking lot excavations, an area suggested already by Bezalel Bar Kochva as the location of the Akra. Indeed, in recent excavations at the Givati parking lot, conducted by Doron Ben Ami and Yana Chechanovic. Today the finds are analyzed and processed by Donald Zvi Ariel and Eyal Zilberstein. I would like to convey my thanks to them and especially to Eyal for her generosity in sharing the latest information about the analysis of the pottery and the coins within the finds. What exactly is it that they found? So firstly, we have a fieldstone wall, which is this right over here. Sorry about that, it's a bit tiny in the picture. A fieldstone wall. This will play a major role in my understanding of the finds later. Then we have a hewn stone tower. The tower is this. It's about 18 meters long, probably longer than that, but that's what the excavators have found. It leans on the wall, and we also have, and this is the most impressive feature, a glacis. That glacis is basically a slanting ramp leaning on the tower, which is part perhaps of the wall, we'll later discuss that, so as to prevent the enemy from getting too close to the foundations of the wall and therefore undermining its stability. This glacis was portrayed or reported previously by Doron and Jana, the excavators, as dating from around the time of Antiochus IV, due to the small finds, mainly coins and potsherds found inside. However, recent study shows that actually we have the two glacis. One of them, or the earliest of them, is the southern section. We're looking at the glacis. This is a section of the glacis. We're looking at it from the north. So that section over here is the earliest feature. Indeed, it probably dates, according to the new analysis, to the time of Antiochus IV. So maybe we do have a portion of the Akra, therefore. And then we have the other part, the northern section, which is here. And in here we have potsherds dating from a later period. What later period? Well, probably later than the time of Antiochus VII Sidates. That is around 130. Here it is, around or post 130 BCE. Whether it is indeed post or not, I can't tell. This is something for the archaeologists amongst you to decide. But this is what they reported to me. We have indeed one portion at least of this glacis dating perhaps from the time of Antiochus IV, and maybe therefore this is indeed part of the Akra. This is a reconstruction, courtesy of the IAA, of the finds over here. You can see here the actual finds, the slanting, sloping glacis, the tower and the wall, and here's the reconstruction. This is the preserved height of the glacis, around 4 meters, I'd say. To that you need to add about 8 meters. We can calculate that. That's what the excavators did, judging by some remains over here. That gives us the angle of the slope over here, so it's about 8 meters higher than what was here. So let's say about 10, 15 meters high. On top of that, you need to add, of course, the wall itself, maybe perhaps another 5 meters, altogether about 20 meters. We'll get to that later in a moment. Anyhow, another part, seemingly another part of the same fortification, was found on the other side of the city of David, on the eastern side, on the eastern slope, in an area called Area G. This is the famous archaeological site dug by Professor Eyal Shiloh. Whatever you see here has nothing to do with the Hellenistic period, unfortunately. The actual glacis can still be seen at a small window in the southern part of the fortifications, but when we take the finds here from Area G together with the finds at the Givati parking lot, west and east, we get a narrow line of fortifications, perhaps too narrow to be a city wall, and therefore that may corroborate the analysis of the excavators that what we have here are the walls of the Accra and not the walls of the city, because that would be obviously an appropriate option to ask whether these are the city's walls. No, say the archaeologists, they are not the city walls. These are the remains of a fortification which was narrower and therefore within the confines of Jerusalem's walls in the 2nd century. So this is area Givati area, and this is the fortifications in the area G. Okay, also found within the glacis are huge numbers of jars. Many of them are what we call the Rhodian imported, which of course bring to mind the question of what is the value as indicating chronology and or ethnicity. Chronologically speaking, the Rhodian jar handles are indeed a chronological indicator, as they are found in the city of David, and they are dating until the time of, let's say, around 145 BCE, which is roughly the time of the destruction of the Akra. And the major question, of course, is what is it doing in the city of David, assuming that the city of David at the time in the 2nd century is a Jewish city. Why do we have imported wine jars in the city of David, something which is usually typical more of Gentile populations in this country and not Jewish populations? It brings up many questions about the characteristics of Jewish law in the 2nd century BCE. We know next to nothing about it. Most of the laws that we know about ritual baths, not drinking Gentile, that is non-Jewish wine, all these laws come from much later sources. It is doubtful whether the knowledge that we have from later periods should be applied to the 2nd century BCE, so let's leave it for a while untouched. The main arguments that support the identification of at least part of the glacis as well as the tower and wall on which the glacis relies with the Accra fortifications are one, location south of the Temple Mount, which is something we can learn from both the books of Maccabees and Josephus. Massive fortification, including a glacis whose southern part is dated to the period of Antiochus IV, according to the coins, as we mentioned earlier. And the width of the wall, too narrow to be a city's wall, and therefore perhaps a fortification within the walls. However, I'd like to offer humbly and carefully another view about the finds. This view is based on the analysis of the written sources and also a reinterpretation of the archaeological remains. Well, Josephus Flavius in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, mentions, well, in several places, he mentions the Akra, and from these scattered records of the Akra, we can learn, I believe, also from the books of Maccabees, about the whereabouts of the Akra within the city. And it says here that Jonathan is one of the Hasmonean brothers after the Hasmonean revolt, who reigns from the year 160 to 143, merely 4 years after the time of Antiochus IV, after his death. And it says here that when Jonathan gathered all people together in the temple and advised them to repair the walls of Jerusalem and to set up again the part of the wall around the temple which had been thrown down, and to fortify the temple precinct by higher towers. And in addition, to build still another wall in the midst of the city to keep the garrison in the citadel from reaching the city, and in this way cut off their large supply of provisions. He builds a wall in the midst of the city to cut off the Akra. Here's Jerusalem as it may have looked in the time of the 2nd century BCE. It includes the area of the city of David. Up here we have the region of the Temple Mount, Mount Zion, as they would call it in the 2nd century BC, and the temple itself is seen here, as you can clearly see. So, if the Akra is located here, according to this reconstruction, following the theory of the Givati parking lot excavations, then of course there's no one way of basically separating the Akra from the city. You either build a wall here or here, but then of course you should build two walls. The sources mention only one wall. It doesn't say that the wall is around the Akra. The only way to fit the historical description is to assume that this structure, this Akra, should be moved next to the Temple Mount, okay, abutting the Temple Mount walls, okay, not far, but really next to it. Okay, this way, if you build a wall, you actually make this separation between the Accra and the city, which is exactly what Josephus says. So, if that is the case, let's look on at the first book of Maccabees. And the first book of Maccabees describes to us the conquest of Jerusalem by Judas the Maccabee, the elder brother of Jonathan, a couple of years before Jonathan builds the walls. And when he conquers Jerusalem, then Judas assigns soldiers the duty of fighting the men in the Accra while he purified the sanctuary. If he needs to assign soldiers or men to fight the men in the Accra in order to secure the builders, I believe that means that the Accra must have been close enough to endanger those working and purifying the temple. It's plausible, and therefore I assume it is another corroboration to the claim that indeed the Accra was really close to the temple. But it is not the only source that we have with regard to that. Here we have another description in the book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees this time, and it relates to the victory of Judas the Maccabee over Nicanor the Seleucid. Nicanor died in the battle. Judas, on his arrival there to Jerusalem, he called together the members of his nation and had the priests stand before the altar. So we should envision Judas the Maccabee, standing next to the altar in the temple, and then he summoned the men from the Accra and showed them the head of the abominable Nicanor and the hand of the blasphemer. So it means that the Accra must have been probably very close to the temple, so as if Judas stands next to the altar and he shows the head of Nicanor, they'd be able to spot that indeed this is Nicanor. Now, Nicanor is not a celebrity. He's not on Facebook in the 2nd century BCE, so he's not like one of the celebrities that we can identify from afar today, okay? And they need to have some clear marks. It means they have to look at him from a close, relatively close distance. So maybe, according to this research, Loftus and Harley from 2005, considering visual perception, at about 150 feet, they claim, around 50 meters, accurate face identification for people with normal vision drops to 0. So we may assume that the distance must have been slightly lower than that, maybe 40 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters, to allow a clear identification of their leader's face held at the hand of Judas the Maccabee. Okay, so that indeed brings us therefore to the conclusion that according to the sources it is plausible. I'm not saying I proved it, but it is plausible. There are other options to analyze, interpret each and every source I just showed, but interestingly enough, in each case I just quoted, there are two possible interpretations. In every case, one interpretation is that the Accra was next to the temple. Is that a coincidence? I don't believe so. I think it has an accumulative value, and therefore it does show something about the whereabouts of the Accra. Conclusions. Based on the accumulative information derived from the historical sources, the Accra fortress must have been located adjacent to the temple, a couple of hundreds of meters to the north of the Givati parking lot excavations and on a considerably higher elevation. Let's get back to the picture here. If the Accra is based here in the Givati parking lot, okay, remember the height, let's say about 20 meters, judging by the height of the remains and the elevation of the foundations of the fortifications found in the Givati parking lot, its top would be, I'd estimate it, around 700 meters above sea level. That's the top of the fortification, whilst the floor of the temple is around 740 meters above sea level. So the top of the Accra is 40 meters below the foundations of the temple. Now we should allow for walls standing around the temple. That means that there's no plausible way people here in the Accra, in Givati parking lot, could ever endanger those who stand around the temple, as consistently it is claimed by the ancient sources. So coming back here, the archaeological finds, what about them? The archaeological finds in the Givati parking lot do not necessarily indicate building activities by Antiochus IV, but perhaps by one of the Hasmonean leaders, perhaps Jonathan, you already got that, soon after. In that case, we have found the earliest phase of the walls built by the Hasmoneans. We'll get to that slightly later in a while. And let me explain what I meant by that. With regard to Antiochus IV's coins, found in the southern part of the glacis core, the Hasmoneans did not mint coins until the second half of the 2nd century BC. Coins of Antiochus' immediate successors are rare, especially in Jerusalem. We don't have much. That's Antiochus V and Demetrius. It is reasonable, therefore, to expect to find Antiochus IV coins in early Hasmonean contexts as well. So if I assume that maybe around 160, 155, Jonathan builds something in Jerusalem, I'd expect to have Antiochus IV's coins scattered around and not something else. So the evidence from the coins, as I said, does not necessarily corroborate the Akra theory. It may, but it's not necessarily a corroboration for that theory. The width of the fortifications I mentioned earlier between Givati on the western side and Area G on the eastern side of the hill is not indicative of the width of the city's fortifications along the ridge. That's an important point. The city's walls simply adjust to the narrow contours of the bedrock at this specific point. Let me show you again. We're talking here about a wall found on that side, Area G, and a wall found here in the Givati parking lot. And we said it's probably not the city's wall because it's too narrow. But we assumed that this width actually continues down and upwards. This is, of course, not true. The reason the distance between the two walls at this location is such is because of the contours of the rock. These are the narrow shoulders of the city of David. That's exactly where I'd expect to find the city's walls, and not necessarily a narrow fortification within. So that consideration also isn't decisive. Okay, so if we take all these considerations together, what is the meaning? What would be the interpretation that we should now give to the finds in the Givati parking lot? Firstly, we have fieldstone wall, Persian or First Temple period maybe. That's my suggestion. Excavations at the wall are now being conducted by Yuval Gadot from the Tel Aviv University. Maybe we'll know more about the actual dating of the wall in the near future. But for the moment, we have a fieldstone wall based right here. As far as I'm concerned, it is not part of the glacis and the tower, which may have been added later. So this might be as early as the Persian era or the First Temple period. We know that substantial sections of the walls of the First Temple period still stood during the Second Temple period. Actually, they were incorporated into the walls of the Second Temple period in other places. The other fragment, the other section, of course, is the wall, the tower and the glacis, and they are made of hewn stone. It's a hewn stone tower and the southern part of the glacis, which is this section, and they are early Hasmonean, I believe, maybe from the time of Jonathan. Actually, in the description of Jonathan's activities, when he built the wall, it was, I don't know if you've noticed, it said that he built the wall using square stones or hewn stones or ashlars. I think they made a point here because when you look at the fortifications, indeed, this section is indeed made of hewn stones, whilst that part is made of unhewn stones, field stones. It fits the description of the situation during the time of Jonathan. He adds a square stone wall, and he already had probably a fortification, pre-existing fortification that he still uses. And finally, the last part would be, and that's according to the excavators at the moment, the northern part of the glacis, which will date to the second half of the 2nd century. Okay, now the question is, should we expect to find any remains of the Akra? Well, there's a famous description of the destruction of the Akra by Simon, one of the brothers, the Hasmonean brothers. It is to be found only in Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus Flavius, and not in the book of Maccabees. Nevertheless, many scholars agree that the fact that it is not mentioned in the book of Maccabees is not important at all, because there might have been 2 stages. First, we know that this structure, this Accra citadel, was taken by Simon, according to the book of Maccabees. He stationed a garrison in that Accra fortress, and maybe on the 2nd stage he destroyed it. Professor Bar Kokhba suggests that he actually destroyed the Accra because Antiochus VII, Sidetes, actually required to get the Accra back. And to avoid such requests, such demands, he simply destroyed it. Maybe that is the story. So I'd say that there's an agreement between many scholars that the Accra was indeed destroyed, even though it is not mentioned in the book of Maccabees. Moreover, look what Josephus says about the foundations of the Accra. Having done this, he thought it would be an excellent thing, and to his advantage, to level also the hill on which the citadel stood, in order that the temple might be higher than this. And so they all set to and began to level the hill, and without stopping work night or day, after 3 whole years, brought it down to the ground and the surface of the brought it down to the ground and the surface of the plain. Okay. And thereafter the temple stood high above everything else, once the citadel and the hill on which it stood had been demolished. Most scholars who dealt with the question regard this addition as inconceivable. They say it is not possible, because they believe that the Accra was located in the city of David. And indeed, in the city of David, even in the area between the city of David and the Temple Mount, there are no traces of large quarrying that could be assigned to this description. But I believe they were looking the wrong direction. And why? This is the Temple Mount. I assumed, as I said, that the Accra was somewhere next to the temple. This is the Dome of the Rock. Most scholars agree the temple would have been here, somewhere around that. So the Accra should be located somewhere around here, according to my interpretation. Okay, so let's see what happens on the Temple Mount. We have a platform. We call now the upper platform, on top of which, it's bedrock by the way, on top of which the Dome of the Rock stands today. We also have a lower platform, which is the region around that platform. Let's take a look at it from another angle, and this is almost the end of my lecture. James, don't worry, I'm aware of the time. And so the upper platform is right here. People are now climbing on a flight of steps, and the lower platform can't be seen, but it's right below these steps. I suggest that as this platform is definitely artificial, okay, this is not the natural peak of a mountain, and as the difference of heights between the top here and the bottom here is about 4 meters, I suggest that we are witnessing here the results of the lowering, the decapitation of the hill on top of which the Accra once stood. This should not be ascribed to King Herod, neither to Abdel Malik, according to Ehud Netzer, who suggested that some of the quarrying activities on the Temple Mount was done by Abdel Malik in the 7th century, the Umayyad dynasty. I believe this is the missing link to the location of the Accra, and it was right there before our eyes all the time. Thank you so much.